Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, we've got a great show today. Very excited about today's show because recent events in the news have just, set me up to talk about what we're going to talk about today. It's something I probably would have talked about eventually anyway, but like I said, recent events in the news have set me up to talk about this right now. Okay. So the first thing I want to do here is I want to plant the seed. I want to tell you where we are going because, as is frequently the case, what we also want to do here is we want to back up and we want to get a running start with regard to what we're going to talk about. We want to set the context. So therefore, before we jump into setting the context, I want to tell you where we're going. And it's real simple where we're going. Herod the Great, okay, who is a central figure in the nativity story, in all of the research I have done with regard to God Save the King. Herod the Great was appointed the president of the Greek Olympics in 12 BC. Now, he would have been in his 60s at that time, but when Herod was a younger man, he was a supreme athlete, and he had a tremendous interest in athletics, in sports, but also in hunting and things like that. So he had a reputation as an extraordinary, the key word, as an extraordinary athlete. So it's not surprising that he would have an interest in such things. And he was appointed president of the Greek Olympics for life in 12 BC. Now, we're going to talk much more about that. That's what today's show is all going to be about, and it's obvious why. It's because right now the Olympics are going on. The modern day Olympics are taking place in France, okay? And then the opening ceremony was last week, and there was a bit of controversy surrounding the opening ceremonies because the opening ceremonies were pretty blatantly anti-Christian. Okay, so it's been in the news, and that's why this is a great setup for me to talk about the Olympics in general and Herod the Great in particular, and the fact that he was the president of the Olympics and how that affects our perception of who he was and what the environment, what the environment was like at the time that Jesus was born, because we learn more about who this guy was, what he was like, and therefore, because he was the Roman appointed king of Judea, what was Judea like? See, because we're aware that he was supposedly religiously Jewish, okay? Supposedly religiously Jewish, and yet, as we're going to see, the inauguration of Greek-style games in Judea, not just in Greece itself, okay, but the inauguration of Greek-style athletic events in Judea itself was viewed as a religious affront to devout Jews. A religious affront to devout Jews. So I'm giving away my punchline here, but it really shouldn't come as a surprise to those who are religiously devout, whether of a Christian or a Jewish persuasion, that the Olympics would be offensive to us, because they always have been and they always will be. Okay, so let's do exactly what I said now, which is let's wind the tape backwards and let's get a running start on why this is the way it is. Why are the Olympics worldly, right? Why are the Olympics worldly? Okay. Now, even before we get there, I got a couple other things I've got to do. The first one, of course, is this. If you enjoy content like this, would you please like, follow, subscribe, etc., etc. God Save the King and the Truth Be Told Radio Network on whatever platform happens to be your favorite, whether it's a video format on Rumble, whether it is a podcast format on any of the multiple major podcast platforms where you can find God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, or whether you like simply an audio format, a streaming format, streaming audio, where you can simply go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network website and click on the Listen Live button. Regardless of which method you use, would you please like, follow, subscribe, hit that bell, smash that like button, etc., 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 because very simply that helps the algorithm, which means it helps us help you. It helps us continue to bring you content like this on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. So there you go. Those are the standard disclaimers that go with social media. Thank you for helping us. Now, if you look at the recent history of God Save the King, if you go back into the archives of the shows that I have done for about the past 3 to 6 months, you're going to get a fair number of shows where I discuss the early chapters of the book of Genesis. All right. Genesis chapters 1 through 11. And there's multiple shows. There's certain shows where I discuss those chapters directly, others where I reference them. And there's really good reason for this. And that is because Genesis chapters 1 through 11 are some of the most profound literature ever written. Period. End of discussion. Some of the most profound literature ever written. It's really just that simple. And it is some of the most profound literature ever written for good reason. And that is because it is primordial epic poetry. Primordial epic poetry. Now, you have to understand that in a classical sense. It's primordial epic poetry the same way Homer would be epic poetry, the way the Greeks or the Romans or the Babylonians, if you're looking at or the Sumerians or the Akkadians, any Mesopotamian primordial origin story, okay? The Epic of Gilgamesh, right? The Anu, Anna, and Leal, right? Any of the Babylonian epics, right? Same thing. Epic primordial poetry. Now, this does not mean that the Bible is untrue. See, this is a big reason that I brought this material to your attention, is because there is this unnecessary focus that the Bible must be literally true at all times in order to be true. And that, ironically, is not true, because poetry can be true. I used the example of the story of the Star-Spangled Banner and the Battle of Baltimore, and how that poem was written, and that poem records an historical event in poetic language. The bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. So in other words, every time a bomb exploded, they could see this giant flag flying over Fort McHenry, which meant that the battle was still going, which meant the Americans had not surrendered, which means there's still hope of winning this battle. So it's an historical record, and it is true, but it's written in poetic language. Well, the same is true for the book of Genesis, especially chapters 1 through 11. Chapter 12 begins what appears to be a legitimate historical narrative, whereas 1 through 11 are once again, this primordial poetic language. Now, therefore, so like I said, it can be true even if it's not literal, even if it is poetic, even if it is symbolic, even if it is not analytical, it can still be true. Okay. Now, why is this important? Well, this is important because it appears that Genesis chapter 1 is not an analytical narrative of the material creation. Let me say that again. It appears that Genesis 1 is not an analytical narrative of a material creation, but is rather a poetic narrative of a functional creation. Pardon me, let me clear my throat here and get a little bit of a drink. For those of you that can't see what I'm doing, on video that's audio only. That was me clearing my throat and getting a drink. So once again, Genesis 1 does not appear to be an analytical narrative of a material creation, but rather a poetic narrative of a functional creation. And that functional creation is the creation of a temple. Okay, it's temple language. The garden is the temple. And what is a temple? A temple is where God lives. A temple is where God resides. See, so that is the functional record of Genesis 1, is it's all about God creating a home, okay, a place where he is going to live on earth. See, not just in the spirit realm, not just in the heavenly realms, see more poetic language there, but on earth, creating a home in the material realm where God is going to live. So a temple is primarily where God lives, and then secondarily, a temple is where humanity interacts with God and worships God. Now that's important because a temple is not primarily where we worship God. It's primarily where God lives. God lives in the temples. That's the whole idea behind all temples in all of human history, is that we would build temples, quote unquote, right? Where God would come down and dwell. That was the whole idea, was it was humanity either building a place where God could come down or building a place where we would try to reach him. Now that's another story for another day. But at any rate, Genesis chapter 1 has all of this poetic temple terminology woven throughout it. See, and then you get to the end of the record but it's God building it. See, this really provocative that it's God building his residence on earth, right? And then God places an image of himself. See, if it was the other way around, if it was humanity building a temple, right? If it's humanity building a temple, then we would place a graven image of God in the inner sanctuary of the temple. But in this case, it's God crafting an image of himself and placing it in the sanctuary in the garden. See, so that's extraordinarily provocative because it's not exactly the same as all of the quote unquote pagan records from all through the ancient Near East. See, these records are different. They have a lot of similarities, but they've also got a lot of distinctions, right? A lot of similarities and also a lot of distinctions. But the point being is that a temple is where God lives, and a temple is where humanity interfaces with God, which is why we get this really interesting record in Genesis 3 of Eve talking to a serpent, quote unquote, the Hebrew word nakash, which can be translated serpent, but it also can be translated the prognosticator, or frankly the deceiver, or it can be translated the shining one. So the implication here is that the nakash is not a snake, it's not an animal, it is a spirit being that lives in the garden. Why would there be a snake in the garden? See, if that's the place where God and humanity interface, but it makes complete sense that there would be other spirit beings, lesser spirit beings than the one true God, also abiding, quote unquote, around the throne, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So at any rate, but in the ancient Near East was a subsistence economy. So that means you and me, or anybody just living our life, things like food and water would have been extremely important because we needed to arrange for that on a day-to-day basis. You didn't necessarily have mass production, and you certainly didn't have mass storage, certainly not like we do today. You did have some of that, right? But things like famines and plagues and floods and drought and stuff like that would really affect a subsistence economy, whether food and water would be consistently available. But in contrast to humanity, see, the gods would have lived somewhere where food and water were plentiful. See, and that's another reason, little side note here, that's why so many pagan religions offer food to the gods. It was our obligation, humanity's obligation in many pagan cultures, to make sure the gods were fed. See, and they would offer food to the gods, either as animal sacrifice, but also in agricultural ways and things like that. But think about the contrast here. Humanity lives in a subsistence economy, but the gods, or God, lives in a garden, a lush garden where food and water are abundant and plentiful. Okay. Now, but in addition, and here we go, now we're going to start tying it together. But in addition to it being called a garden, in other areas of scripture, in particular in Ezekiel, it's also called the mountain of God. And the two are not mutually exclusive. It's very easy to either have a garden on a mountain or a mountain in a garden, because the garden that's described is pretty big. So would it be easy to have a mountain in the garden? Yeah, it'd be very easy, right? So we are told that Lucifer was in the mountain of God, resided in the mountain of God before iniquity was found in him, right? So that makes complete sense that God, right, and other spirit beings inhabited the garden and lived on the mountain of God. So my point behind all of this is that this is common to all of human mythopoetic primordial history, whether it is the Bible or extra biblical, whether it is Egyptian or Canaanite or Mesopotamian. It is common to human primordial mytho-epic poetry that the gods lived on mountains. The gods lived on mountains. And now, if we go back to the seed I planted, one of the most preeminent examples of the gods living on mountains is the fact that the Greek pantheon lived on Mount Olympus. The Greek pantheon lived on Mount Olympus. And of course, the father god, the supreme god, was the god Zeus. And it should not therefore come as a surprise to anyone that see, here it is. This should not surprise you. If what I'm about to say surprises you, then that's why this is such a hullabaloo in the media right now, because the ancient Olympic Games were not a secular affair, not even remotely. They were worship. They were sacred games dedicated to Zeus on Mount Olympus, for crying out loud. That's what the Olympics were, because the word Olympic gets its name from Mount Olympus, and these were religious dedicated games dedicated to the gods, and there was sacrifice and festivals and feasting and athletic competition and all this stuff wrapped up into a religious festival. It was a religious festival. So why should it surprise us that at the opening of the 2024 Olympics, that the inauguration ceremony celebrated humanity and basically, made a profane gesture in the direction of Jesus of Nazareth and the Christian faith? It really should not surprise us that the Olympics are worldly, because the word secular, by the way, just simply means worldly. Okay. And the world, when the world embraces being worldly, that means they're basically being idolatrous. That's really what it boils down to, is that worldliness it's idolatry. It's really just that simple. So wouldn't, it really shouldn't come as a surprise to us that the Olympics are worldly. I haven't watched the Olympics in decades for exactly that reason, because they are so worldly. It's like, it just makes me sick to my stomach. It makes it very hard for me to watch the Olympics. Now, of course, if you go back to the 1980 Olympics and the Miracle on Ice, the U.S. Olympic hockey team defeating the Soviet Union and going on to win the gold medal. And, I have close ties to that. I knew some of the members of that team. I was at the University of Minnesota at that time when Herb Brooks was the coach of the Minnesota Gophers, and, watched them win NCAA titles, and then watched, several members of the Gophers go play for Herb Brooks on the Olympic team and then win that gold medal. See, now that was much more nationalism. And see, the Olympics disguise themselves as nationalism, but that's not really what the Olympics are about. See, the cover story, the camouflage, the counterfeit is that the Olympics are all about, it's all about diversity, and it's all these nations getting together, and we celebrate everybody, and we celebrate everybody's culture, and everybody is wonderful. And that's not really what it's about. It's really all about exalting humanity, and it's anti-God, certainly anti the true God. So at any rate, how does this tie? What's the origin of the Olympics, and how does it tie into Herod the Great? How did Herod the Great come to be the president of the Greek Olympics? Because he was. What an amazingly interesting contrast now to learn that Herod the Great, who is, oh my word, I mean, this is what God Save the King has been about for decades. See, this is what God Save the King has been about for decades. And if you have not seen my show before, not heard my show, if this is the first time, let me either tell you or remind you, if you have heard it before, where this title comes from. Okay. See, God Save the King is a pun. Okay. It's a play on words, because God Save the King was a phrase that was used to extol the monarch, right? You would have, when people would extol the king of the realm, they would say, "Oh, great king, live forever," or "Oh, great king, God save the king. May you live forever. Long may he reign." Different phrases like this. Okay. It's in the Bible. Okay. Similar, not precisely that phrase, but extraordinarily similar phrases are in the Bible, where the kings in the Old Testament were extolled and said, long may he reign, may he live forever. God save the king. God protect the king. Right? God protect the king. But then when we get to the story of Herod, and you get to this part of the story where we talk about the massacre of the innocents, the killing of the male children in and around Bethlehem that were under 2 years old. Okay, so now what king are we talking about? Are we talking about the Roman appointed king of Judea, who was a Roman appointee, not an ethnic Jew, potentially a religious proselyte, but how devout was he? Because there's a very, very mixed story on heresy, and that may be the precise point, is to draw the contrast between Herod and Jesus, because Jesus is the newborn king and the true-born king of the Jews. And yet Herod he's not even Jewish ethnically. He is a combination of Idumean and Nabatean. Now, Idumea, that is the Latinized form of the English word Edom, right? And it's also the Latinized form of the Greek and the Hebrew from 2,000 years ago, right? but the Latin word would have been Idumean, right? In English, we would say Edom, right? And the Edomites, they're the descendants of Esau. See, in the East, the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, were not looked upon as true Jews by the Jews, because the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, did not go through the Exodus, right? And the Exodus is the inauguration of the Jewish nation, that Joseph goes to Egypt, becomes vizier of Egypt. He eventually brings his family to Egypt, and then a long time later, it says that there came up a pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and the Jews are basically slaves, and they are oppressed by the Egyptians. And then you have the story, of course, of Moses, the deliverer, leading them out. Well, the descendants of Esau didn't go through any of that. So from a Jewish perspective, the Edomites are not Jews, right? Well, Herod was apparently, many centuries later, a descendant of Esau. He is an Edomite. Now, that's because his father was an Edomite. His mother was Nabatean. So his mother was what today we would basically call an Arab, from the nation or the kingdom of Nabatea back then. So he's not Jewish. He's not ethnically Jewish, apparently, at all, right? Now, the Edomites converted to Judaism roughly 100 years before Herod, roughly. Very rough, very rough. So Herod's father was apparently Jewish by religion, and apparently raised Herod to be Jewish by religion. Pardon me here, gotta scratch my nose for a sec. And Herod's father, Antipater, served in the court of the high priest. So they definitely bumped up against the Jewish religion all the time. But once again, this may be the point, because there's a difference between bumping up against it and actually being it, right? Because everything about Herod cries out close, but not quite. And sometimes not even close, right? Where the distinction is frankly so significant that it's like, yeah, you might have the right label slapped on there, but the heart of the matter is completely different, right? So the original Olympic Games derive their name from Mount Olympus, the home of the Greek pantheon, the home of the Greek gods. And the ancient games were a quadrennial affair. In other words, every 4 years, right? And Greek timekeeping was even marked by what are called Olympiads, periods of 4 years, right? And they're even used, throughout the what's the word I want to use here? The reference works that I consult to, do the research into God Save the King. A lot of the references use Olympiads as their time frame. They talk about it. Josephus mentions Olympiads. It's not unusual at all. But at any rate, the Olympics were a quadrennial affair every 4 years, and they were held, here you go, they were held at a sacred site marked by temples to Zeus and his consort Hera, right? See, and the word would go out not just within Greece itself, but to neighboring countries and nations to invite in the athletes that would come, and then they would engage in these athletic contests at these sacred sites, at these temples for Zeus and Hera. And the games would last for 5 days, and there would be ritual sacrifice of 100 bulls offered to Zeus. See, so there would be sacrifice, there'd be blood sacrifice, there would be games, there would be banquets, there would be feasting and food and all this stuff. So this is a sacred festival. It's part of a sacred festival, for crying out. It is worship of the pagan gods. You can't make it any clearer, okay? Now, what's really interesting about this is that the like I said, the athletes would come from around the Hellenistic world, right? Any country that spoke Greek, they would be invited, probably even others as well. And see, there was a council, okay, that oversaw the organization of the games. Now, this council that was called the Hellenodikai, right? This council, they were the organizers, but they were also like the judges and the referees. Okay. So they were a large organization, referees, judges, and organizers. But what they would do is they would also pay for the games. Okay. So the prize money, the sacrificial animals, the travel and accommodation expenses for the athletes, the food, the banqueting, the festivities, all that stuff was paid for by this council that oversaw the games. So that's some pretty serious money that went into these festivals to worship the Greek gods. So the council was called the Hellenodikai, right? And then the chief or the president or the superintendent of the games was called the agonothetes. Agonothetes. And that's from the Greek word agones, which means contest or game or fight contest, right? And then thetes, which meant free man. So it's the free man's games, the free man's contests, right? So that's where, so the like I said, the superintendent was called the agonothetes, right? And although the ancient roots of this style of game go back even further, okay, the ancient Greek games at Olympus, okay, at Olympia, were inaugurated in 776 BC, okay, and then they ran through until about 393 AD. So just shy of about 1,200 years is when you had the ancient Greek games at Olympus. Now, there were other ancient Greek games at other cities, because we have to remember that ancient Greece was not so much a unified country necessarily as it was city-states and regions. See, so you had different city-states, different regions, and they had games as well. But these games at Olympus, at Olympia, right, were inaugurated in 776 BC and then lasted until just short of 400 AD, almost 1,200 years. Okay, now, but take note of the time frame, because if you remember your ancient history, as we talk about frequently here on God Save the King, that time frame, see, 776 BC, well, that's at the height of like the Assyrian Empire, although the Assyrian Empire didn't reach all the way to the Greek mainland necessarily, but it did reach into what would be modern day Turkey, Anatolia. See, the Assyrian Empire was there, and then you have this succession of empires where you've got the Assyrian Empire, then the Babylonian Empire, then the Persian Empire, and then the Greek Empire. See, now if you've listened to God Save the King, or if you know your ancient history, you know that it was Alexander the Great's desire to make the known world Greek. He did want, see, here you go, he wanted a one world culture. He wanted a one world culture where the entire world would speak Greek and would practice Greek culture and would practice Greek religion. Now, I didn't have the time to go check this out. Also, Alexander's career was predominantly conquest. So I don't know if and when he had any time to really start establishing things like games, right? I also haven't had the opportunity to check whether his successors, right, did it. Especially, did the Seleucids or did the Ptolemies start any games? I'm unaware of whether they did that or not, right? But games on the Greek mainland and in the Greek islands surrounding Greece, and apparently in Asia Minor, were quite common throughout these different empires. Even if it weren't the Greeks directly in control, apparently the games continued and were pretty darn common. But then you get this very interesting that happened in 146 BC. In 146 BC is when the Romans conquered the Balkan Peninsula. It's when the Romans conquered the Greek peninsula and occupied it, right? So when the Romans took over, something really interesting happened, because the Romans, see, usually when you're the conquering culture, your culture takes over. But what was very interesting is that when the Romans conquered the Greeks, they started adopting a lot of Greek culture. Very interesting. Particularly Greek architecture was enormous. The Romans really embraced Greek architecture. But the one thing the Romans didn't do right away, it took quite a bit of time, was they didn't embrace Greek style games. It wasn't until the Augustan age that the Romans began embracing Greek style Olympic games. But they did embrace other elements of Greek culture, like I said, primarily Greek construction and architecture. That attracted the attention of the Romans big time, big time. So Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, the general Marcus Agrippa, they built Greek style architecture in Rome, and then also in Greece, because now you've got Rome controlling Greece, right? So they built or rebuilt a lot of the structures that had been destroyed in the wars. See, so really interesting that the Romans were really devoted to Greek architecture, but not so much with regard to the Greek games, right? And they also embraced a lot of Greek religion, but obviously it was with the religion was so similar that you've actually got the Roman pantheon. So you've got the Roman names for the Greek gods. The gods themselves are virtually identical. You just have different names. You've got Ares and Mars and Jupiter and Zeus and, et cetera, right? Venus and Aphrodite, all this stuff. So you've got the equivalents in Rome and the equivalents in Greek. You just got Latin and Greek names for the essentially the same pantheon. And of course, there's some variation. Of course there is, right? But the point being is that they didn't embrace the games. The Greek peninsula became, apart from Roman influence like this, became rather impoverished. And that was probably due to, frankly, Roman taxation. Roman taxation to pay for everything is probably why the Roman peninsula became impoverished. And when the money goes down like that, one of the first things to suffer, of course, is any kind of festival or celebration, because you don't have the quote unquote extra money for the festivals and the celebration. And because the Olympic Games were part of a religious festival, that means that they started to fall into disinterest. As a matter of fact, they started to fall into, frankly, poverty, and they frankly were discontinued. So and this happened little by little over time, beginning in 146 when the Romans conquered the Greek peninsula, right? And then once you get to the Augustan age, that's when you see things start to flip a little bit, right? Now, as I mentioned, the Romans were really into the architecture. So Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, Marcus Agrippa, they all built resplendent buildings on the Greek peninsula. They rebuilt Athens. They rebuilt Sparta, right? Well, now you have to enter in Herod the Great, right? Because Herod the Great becomes the Roman client king of Judea, appointed that in 40 BC, and then takes effective control in 37/36 BC, right? And Herod is renowned for being an extraordinary builder. I'm going to suggest to you that he was actually the greatest builder of his age, okay? That he surpassed Augustus Caesar. He was the greatest builder of his age. Now, and here you go, because this is where we get to the meat of it, right? Herod is most widely known, of course, for the renovation of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Okay, it's the renovation began in 2221 BC, and then it was inaugurated in like 18 or 17. The dates are wobbly only because we don't know exactly when these things happened. Frankly, it's really that. So we know roughly when they happened, but let's see, as we've talked about in God Save the King, a lot of this is based upon Herod's death, right? And I challenge the traditional date of Herod's death. The traditional date is 4 BC. I think he died in 1 BC. So if any of these dates are based off of his death, right? So if they're based off of the traditional date, then they might be off by as much as 3 years. Okay, so anyway, so Herod is most widely known for his renovation of the Jewish temple. His renovation of the Jewish temple went beyond that of Solomon. It was more glorious than Solomon. Herod actually, as a matter of fact, modeled himself after Solomon, not David, Solomon. Okay, he pretended to be a Davidic king, but not David, Solomon, right? So what better way to be Solomon than to renovate the temple, right? So number one on his list is the temple. Number two that he is probably most known for among his building projects are probably his fortresses, okay? Because he either built or renovated fortresses all throughout it's his empire. It's Herod's empire. Let's call it what it is, right? So he had a fort, and it was a fortress slash palace. So either a straight up fortress or a fortress palace, which is they were usually both, right? So he had a fortress at Masada. He had a fortress at Herodium outside Bethlehem. He had a fortress at Machaerus. He had a fortress at Alexandrium. He had 4 palaces in Jericho. And then he had another fortress slash palace at Caesarea Maritima. Okay, so number one is the temple. Number 2 is his fortresses. Number 3 is probably his project at Caesarea Maritima. And there, I'm not referring to simply his fortress slash palace. I'm referring to the fact that at Caesarea Maritima, Herod built an entire city and created a port, a deep water port, where one did not exist. Okay, so you want to talk about an extraordinary construction architectural feat. Okay, Herod, wow, built a city and created a port where one did not exist. And like I said, that's number 3 on his list. Okay. And then number 4 is that all throughout Judea and all throughout the ancient Near East. So we're talking about Damascus and Ptolemais and Tripolis, all these Assyrian cities, these Syrian cities, and up into Asia Minor, Herod built temples dedicated to Augustus. Okay. He was nuts for it. He built, and Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea. It's dedicated to Caesar. And Maritima simply means on the water or by the sea. Caesarea by the sea. Okay, it's an entire city dedicated to Caesar, right? But I've been playing a game with you because I said number 1 is the temple, but that's what he's most known for. Okay. Number 2 is his fortresses. Number 3 is Caesarea Maritima, the entire project. Number 4 is his temples to Caesar, Augustus. But there's an extraordinarily unknown factor about Herod's building project. His number 1 most common building project, okay, all throughout Judea, all throughout the ancient Near East, is he built athletic structures. That was actually number 1. He spent more time, more money, more resources, more locations building gymnasiums, stadiums, arenas, amphitheaters, racetracks, hippodromes, all this stuff. He built it all throughout Judea and the ancient Near East. That was his number 1 building project, was anything athletic. Anything athletic, right? So Herod, in his lifetime, to the best of our knowledge, made 3 trips to Rome. The final and third trip to Rome, he went to Olympia. Okay? He went to Olympia, and because the Olympic Games were in such disrepair, had fallen into such neglect, he committed to rebuilding the area, put money into rebuilding Olympia, and he committed himself to paying for the Olympics for the rest of his life. And therefore, as a result, he was named president of the Greek Olympics for the rest of his life. Now, you can look at that as saying, okay, well, he bought it, okay, which in a manner of speaking, he did. In a manner of speaking, he did buy the presidency. But the point being is that the president or superintendent of the Olympics, that was his responsibility. His responsibility was to organize and pay for the Olympic Games. And that is what Herod did. Okay, now it's important to note that in 12 BC, okay, Herod's pushing 60. Okay, so he is not going to participate in the games himself, but he was a very skilled athlete when he was younger. This is something else we have to remember about not Herod only, but of the men of that day and age. A lot of these men were truly extraordinary, truly extraordinary men. And again, this gets us into the contrast between Herod and Jesus, right? Because see, everything about Herod screams what an extraordinary man he was. It really does, right? We make him the villain of the Nativity, right? And because we make him the villain of the Nativity, our Hollywood conditioned brain wants to make him, the sniveling, snidely whiplash, evil, Dr. Evil kind of character. But that's really not what he was like. Everything we know about Herod said he was good looking, okay? He was an athlete. He was strong. He was fast. He was athletic. He was an extraordinary horseman, right? We're talking, remember how I said he is from Idumean and Arabian ancestry. Think about the classical Arabian horseman, right? Well, that's Herod, see? And the cavalry of that day, they were the special warfare operators of their day, right? Because they had to have the money to own horses, and they had to have the money to be trained not only to ride, but to fight on horseback. So that meant your supreme warriors of the day were your horse warriors, right? Of every culture, right? If that culture had horse warriors, they were the elite. So you're talking about Idumean and Nabatean horse warriors. You've heard me talk extensively about the Parthians, right? The Romans didn't have an enormous cavalry tradition themselves, but they did have a cavalry tradition because Julius Caesar was an amazing cavalryman, and he was the one who started the idea of a praetorian, which was his personal bodyguard that were all cavalry, and therefore they could move extremely quickly because they were always on horseback, right? And he deliberately hired mercenaries from other nations and kingdoms and cultures that were skilled cavalrymen. See, and then Herod did the same thing. At Herod's death, it's widely recognized that he had Thracian and German cavalry in his bodyguard. Okay, so Herod was an extremely skilled athlete. So like I said, good looking, smart. I mean, incredibly smart. And look at what kind of a builder he was, how innovative he was, and the fact that he didn't spend years and years and years and years and years studying this stuff. He would get glimpses of it, and he would know how to build it. How did he know to build a deep water port? How did he know this stuff? So these are extraordinary men. So once again, my point being here is now let's look at the contrast. Let's look at the contrast between a man like Herod, where everything about him screams that he's this amazing person in a human sense. In a human sense. Good looking, smart, athletic, strong, warrior, horseman, great with a javelin, right? He could throw the javelin. Great with bow and arrow. He's apparently a tremendous archer, right? And so look at all of these things. Educated, right? Now, he did not come from a hyper elite family, but his, what's the word I want to use? His bona fides, right? Were his curriculum vitae was as good as anybody's. His education was extraordinary, right? So, and then his building program, and then he builds the temple, and look at this massive reputation that he was building, and yet his reputation was also so mixed, right? He's not truly Jewish. He's Idumean and Arabian. Yeah, he's smart, okay, but how much revelation did Herod ever get? Hard to say, right? Pretended to be Jewish for sure. How devout was he? Did he really believe in the God of the Jews, in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Did he believe in Yahweh? Was he devoted to Yahweh? Man, hard to say, right? Murdered his own wife, murdered his own son, murdered the babes around Bethlehem, right? Thinks he's Solomon, builds the temple. So it's all of this worldly everything. And to see, of course, he's the president of the Olympics, because it's all about the exaltation of the creature instead of the creator, right? And then meanwhile, on the other side of the forest, okay, in this little backwater town in the hills of Judea, there is very quietly being born the true born son of David, the true Davidic king, the Messiah of all Israel. And it's in contrast to Herod. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Herod was the president of the Olympics, and that we are seeing the kind of demonstration that we saw last week at the opening ceremony of the Olympics. I'm sorry. I know that might offend some people, but I really believe that the truth is the truth. Okay? The Olympics are not about, how wonderful humanity is and how well we get along, and that we set aside our differences to celebrate, different, because no, we don't. No, we don't. You're fooling yourself if you think that's what the Olympics are about, because they're not. Because we would much rather kill each other. All you have to do is look around the world, and you see the fact that humanity, we don't get along. We don't. We don't get along. We spend as much time, accusing each other and annihilating each other and killing each other and mistreating each other, right? And the Olympics they're not the solution. And they don't represent the solution. They do not represent what is best about humanity. They unfortunately represent what is worst about humanity. And that's exactly what they did last week. Okay, is they stepped up and said, hey, we're going to show you our true colors. And they did. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much going to wrap it up there. I'm really thankful to have had this opportunity to help paint more of this picture in depth for you. See, because Herod, he instituted games. See, and I didn't get a chance to read this, and I won't take the time. I don't have enough time to go there now, but you can go into the works of Josephus. If you want to do this, I'll tell you exactly where to go. You go to Josephus, you go to Antiquity of the Jews, book number 15, chapter 8, verse 1. Okay? Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, book 15, chapter 8, verse 1. Read that, and you'll see the Jews were very offended that Herod started Greek-style Olympic Games in Judea. They were very offended. That section of Scripture, I almost said, that section of Josephus is all about the fact that when Herod instituted these games and seen, he dedicated them to Augustus Caesar. Even though they were Greek-style, quote-unquote, Olympic Games, they were dedicated to Caesar, and he had them every 5 years instead of every 4 years, right? But the Jews were very offended at this. So it's really a very, very provocative contrast that we have between Herod the Great and the culture that he created in Judea at the time of the birth of Christ, and what true devout Jews were looking for. Like I said, he was born in this backwater village, quietly, alone. Shepherds came to worship him, right? Joseph and Mary came from Nazareth, which is the town of the branch, which was probably this little enclave of patriots that knew that they stood a great possibility of bringing forth the Messiah from their midst. Very, very, very provocative. So anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap it up for today. My name is Tim Kais. I am the host of God Save the King, and I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. God Save the King.